Morning, everyone. My name is Barry Weinman. I'm CEO of MyIntegra. We've just gone past 9 a.m. in Perth and 11 a.m. on the East Coast, so we'll just give it a few minutes or a minute or so to allow people to join in. Whilst we're waiting, it'd be great to hear where people are joining us from today. So if you wanted to, in the chat, just pop which part of Australia you're sitting in for this meeting. We'd love to see what that is. And Rob, I'm blind to the answers, so yeah, it'd be great to get a bit of voiceover of where people are joining us from.
Sure, yeah. WA, Melbourne, Perth, Ipswich, Sydney, Perth, everywhere.
Oh, fantastic. Well, welcome. And as we're getting ready to start, I'd just like to comment that you'll have to forgive my casual dress today. I'm actually on holidays down in the Margaret River region of Western Australia, which is just perfect right now. Normally I sit in Perth, and the MyIntegra team are based all over Australia. We've got people in every state and in Australia as well as in the ACT to try and really ensure that we have a localised service that is available to our participants and the service providers that we support through our plan management and support coordination operations. And in Margaret River, I'm actually sitting on the lands of the Wadandi Boyja people. They're part of the broader Noongar Nation in southwest of Western Australia. And I do want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today. And I very much like to pay my respects to elders past and present and look forward to engaging with emerging elders over time. So Rob, how are we doing for numbers now?
Yeah, we're about 145 and growing at the moment.
Oh, fantastic. So let's get underway then. So today I'm delighted to be able to introduce you to Emily Forrest and Jeremy Farley from the NDIS. And as the slide in front of you says, Emily is the acting CEO of NDIS, having taken over since Laurie Lee's departure, and Jeremy's a senior policy officer within the NDIS. And they bring with them a wealth of experience and knowledge on the operations of the NDIS, and particularly around the plight that we're facing as intermediaries operating within the NDIS, or within the NDIS, should I say. I just want to highlight that this call will be recorded, and so Jani, if you wanted to turn the recording on, or Rob, please do. And people will not be able to ask questions, or you won't be seen, so there should not be any privacy concerns. But if you are putting something into the chat or the Q&A, then just bear in mind that that will be captured. In terms of MyIntegra, just a reminder, as I said, we are a national plan management service, and it really is through your support that we're able to bring events like this to you. So we're really grateful for the support that you give to us. And I am pleased to let you know about a new feature that we have available, which we're finding is getting very strong feedback and strong response, which is our new NDIS budget calculator. And what really is exciting about this is that it is one of the first, or what is the first budget calculator that you can use to work out PACE budgets as well as the MyPlace or Proto budgets. It's location specific, so where there is different rebates for different locations, that's captured in the system, and you can search by name or line item number for activities. There is a QR code there, but you can get this from the website. You're able to download the outputs from that as well. And as I said, the feedback we're getting is fantastic, because it is the first calculator that allows you to do PACE budgets. And if you do get a chance to have a look, we would love to hear your feedback on this. If there's anything that you'd like to see improved, please do let us know. As I mentioned, this recording session is recorded. The cameras and microphones are off. You've got the chat and Q&A to be able to ask questions and provide comments. Bear in mind, we will try to get through every question that is asked during the session. If we are unable to, though, we will try and address all questions in a summary document that we'll make available to participants at the end of the meeting. There will also be a recording of the meeting made available for those who missed the meeting or need to drop out partway through, so that you can catch up at the end of that. There's a little ad for us, the MyIntegra details, and as I said, we're really pleased to have NDIS joining us today. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Emily and Jeremy, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Barry, and we've got our slides up there. So, and really appreciate you being on leave and still hosting us at your webinar. So, thank you very much, MyIntegra. We're delighted to be here. I think one of the things Jeremy and I and all the members of the NDIS team like the most is talking to providers and hearing directly from you about what's happening on the ground as you try and deliver services in what is a very, very complex environment at the moment. So it's a great opportunity. We're very much appreciative. So thanks for having us. We're hoping today will be useful for you because there is so much going on. And whilst we can't answer all of the questions about what's happening with the NDIS and the road ahead, you know, we're not the government, and we had our name first. So people do often get us confused with NDIS, but NDS was first. We can't fill in all those details, but we're hoping in this great big jigsaw puzzle that is NDIS reform, we can at least start to fill in some of those edge pieces and have a look at what the future may hold and get some information from you as well that will help us in our advocacy. Now, if you haven't met us before, or you're not a member, or you're not aware of National Disability Services, we are a membership organisation. We have about 1,000 disability service providers as members, and our members are organisations of all sizes, right from sole traders through to your very large multi-state organisations, delivering all kinds of services, so including intermediaries, but you know, across the entire price guide, we'll have members delivering it. There's lots of things we do with members or on your behalf. Is we do lots of networking and events so members can get together. We hold conferences. We do a lot of advocacy, and there's not a great flattering photo of me and our ex-CEO Laurie in Canberra, but we also do a lot of advocacy in states and territories because we have a state office in every state and territory. And we'll do lots of deep dives into particular bits of information. Like at the moment, it feels like we get consumed a lot on PACE, so we'll do deep dives into what's happening with PACE. But we do lots of things like customised employment, homes and living, that sort of thing. So we're a mighty team, and we're delighted to be here. In our session today, and talking to Barry and his team beforehand, we thought what it would be useful to cover is sort of looking at that road ahead. And when we do, we need to look at, well, where are we right now, and what's happening in the current environment? What do we think is coming up around the corner with the proposed reforms, and what can we understand about what that's going to mean for service delivery? And then the further horizon, you know, what's in the future, in particular for support coordination and plan management, given what we know about what's happening with the reforms right now. So to look at where we are right now, we are in, you know, I've worked in government relations for a pretty long time. I've worked in political offices and various industries, and I like to reflect upon what I'm experiencing in disability policy and advocacy at this point in time, because it is more complex than any other industry I've experienced before. And I was working in the Minister's Office federally during the global financial crisis, managing the automotive industry. So like, that was a really busy, complicated and difficult time for industry. This, in comparison, is much more complex. So if you're feeling a bit bewildered about what's going on, I'm not surprised, and you're not alone. I think one of the reasons we're in such a complicated reform environment is, well, there's a few reasons in there, but we've got this really complex political overlay that influences, for better or worse, everything that the sector is going through at the moment. We've got various state and territory elections. We've just had the election in the Northern Territory. ACT and Queensland are coming up very soon, and then we'll be moving into the WA election early next year. And of course, the federal election has to happen sometime in this window as well. Those election cycles aren't new, of course, and they happen all the time. But the reason they're so impactful at the moment on disability reform is much of the reform that we're in is going to rely on really solid federal, state and territory negotiation. That's hard to do in the best of times. it's hard to do even when the majority of the governments are from the same political party. So in this case, the ALP. But even then, without the reforms being so complicated, federal, state and territory negotiations are fraught. You know, it's a really difficult thing to do well, and it's a difficult thing to do fast. Underlying all of this, of course, we are on a road that is being driven by two huge reform vehicles, and that's the Disability Royal Commission and the NDIS review. And there's that constant pressure on top of that about how the NDIS is tracking from a budget perspective, a federal budget perspective, and the sustainability of that scheme for future generations. So if I'm feeling this way, I would not be surprised if you are feeling this way, because it is an incredibly complex environment that we're in the middle of. A lot of the recent reform we've seen going through Parliament, you will have heard in the news, or if you watch the debate, you can see the pressure on governments to get this right. But you can also see how devilishly complex it is to try and do across so many jurisdictions and with such huge cost pressures on governments and government budgets. One of the things that's happened recently, of course, is we've seen that legislation go through Parliament. And I think something that's useful for us to reflect upon in this forum is, even though that legislation is looking at participant plans and budgets and things like that, the really big call to action, I think, will be coming to providers, particularly intermediaries, when all these changes start to come through. So, you know, you're not just trying to manage a sustainable service in a difficult funding environment with an uncertainty in the future about the reform agenda. You're also working, you know, with participants who are managing that same complexity and that same uncertainty. And a lot of that work is not funded work. It's not billable work. It's just the work that you do as disability service providers. So, you know, there's a huge amount of stuff going on. And in that context, I think it's really fair to say that it can be hard to keep your engines running. It can be hard to remain sustainable. It can be hard to avoid burnout. So, you know, that's one of the things I think we need to talk about today. NDIS does an annual survey of members and non-members. It's open to all disability service providers. And it's a fantastic piece of work that we do in partnership with the University of Sydney, because it gives us a really strong pulse check on what's happening in the sector at that time. Unfortunately, last year's survey showed that things were not looking good. And this was delivered and in market before the reports of the Royal Commission and NDIS review were handed down. And it confirmed that last year was the worst year on record since we've been collecting this data for about a decade now for provider viability. So I think the stats are pretty alarming. You know, more than 50% of providers were operating at a loss or just breaking even. Almost 70% said they were really worried they wouldn't be able to continue delivering NDIS services at current prices. And 82%, which I find shocking, received requests for services they could not provide. So there's this huge unmet demand. Providers want to deliver those services, but because of workforce shortages, because of sustainability issues, they can't. You know, you can't just up and increase the load, particularly if you haven't got the workers there to deliver it. So it's a really long-standing problem, and there are big issues with how the NDIS has been set up. You know, it's a great scheme. We don't want it to go anywhere. We do want it to be there for future generations, but there's a lot of problems that need to be fixed within that. And I'll just put in a plug as well. We'll put in a QR code at the end of the presentation, but our State of the Sector survey for this year is now open. So we would love for you to jump on and complete it for us this year so we can get, you know, the latest stats. So even that is not looking great, right? But unfortunately, in the middle of all of this big reform, difficult financial environment, we have the latest annual price review. we weren't expecting amazing things from the NDIA and government with the last annual price review. We were expecting minimum wages to be passed through, but we were hopeful and have certainly been advocating for, along with a range of other provider peak bodies, for improvements in the operating environment for providers. So unfortunately, the price freezes, as you'll well know, for intermediaries has continued now for half a decade. Same with therapy services. There was some very odd things that were just summarily removed from the price guide, like high intensity payments for behaviour support, with no consultation with participants' families, let alone providers. And we know that even with passing through the minimum wage increases to elements of covering disability support work, even with passing that through, it doesn't cover the costs that increase year on year to deliver services, your insurance costs, your onboarding costs, your staff training and supervision, all those overheads that are required, registration costs, for example. So none of those things were taken into account. So it's really, really disappointing, to say the least. We put out a survey in the week following the annual price review, and it was only open for a week, but we had a flood of responses, and we were really getting also a flood of inquiries and really difficult conversations with providers after the price guide about how much they're struggling. And it was, again, really alarming statistics to see 84% of the respondents to our pulse survey after the price guide said they were actively reconsidering their future as a result of the new price limits, and 75% said they were considering stopping some or all of their services. So really difficult stats to hear, but important to share, I think, because if you're in this majority, you're not alone, and it's no surprise that you are feeling this way. So the impact of all of this becomes even more prominent when we think about the major recommendations that are coming through from these big reform vehicles that I talked about before. Obviously, we've got the Disability Royal Commission, and that made a range of recommendations that are relevant for intermediaries. Things like addressing conflict of interest, saying it's not appropriate for support coordinators to provide other funded supports, talking about the need for adequate support coordination in a participant's plan, and talking also a lot about improvements that the NDIS Commission needs to make to how it regulates the entire scheme, how it shares information, how it addresses complaints, how it reports on these things. And then at the same time, we had the NDIS Commission launched its own motion inquiry into intermediaries, and it was part one of an inquiry. And I think positively, it actually found some really great examples of how intermediaries are contributing to the strength of the scheme. So it talked a lot about how the NDIS Commission becomes aware of poor practice, sharp practices, fraud, abuse, neglect, because of the work of intermediaries in the scheme and how important they are for that. It did also highlight some poor practice around conflict of interest, around coercion and sharp practices, and around, taking over aspects of participants' life. And, you and I and all the quality providers in this scheme want to see poor practice, criminals, shonks and frauds out of the scheme as much as the government does. So I think that's, a no-brainer. So the sector has been asked to focus on all of these things and improve quality at the same time that it's not receiving any funding increases, which is essentially a price cut when you think about increases in the cost of living. And at the same time, prepare for really huge changes on the horizon. So that's not an easy task. Now, it's been nearly 9 months now, which actually sounds like a long time because it doesn't feel like that long ago. But it's been 9 months since the NDIS review landed, and we are still looking for certainty from government around what, from that almost 140 actions, what is government going to decide to implement and when? What does that look like? The NDIS review, as you all know, proposed major changes to support coordination and intermediary work and plan management, and we'll get to that a little bit later in the webinar. But at the moment, those recommendations are just that. They are recommendations to government. They are not necessarily government policy. We don't know how government plans to enact them. We don't know against what time frame. I mean, there's some broad time frames being thrown around there, starting next year, foundational supports, 5 years, transitions, all that. But there's no clear sequencing or roadmap for that reform in sight yet. Now, after quite a lot of advocacy and pressure, government has now said that it will do a formal holistic response to the NDIS review by the end of the year. And there are some early moves obviously underway to implement at least some of those recommendations. So, for example, some of the things we've just seen in the NDIS legislation, which we can talk about in more detail in a moment, but also in the last federal budget, there were some measures in there, not huge, but, you know, starting money to start consultation on things, including what navigation could look like. And money to start looking at what independent pricing should also look like, which has been a really big call from NDS for quite a number of years now. There's also work underway through the Provider and Worker Registration Task Force, which has only just recently tabled its report to government. And this is looking at the NDIS review recommendation, which was saying that all providers should be registered in some way, shape or form. So they've agreed to some extent and have proposed a new model. But again, this is not a government policy document. It's all just advice to government at this stage. At this stage, based on what both the NDIS review and this task force have proposed, support coordination and plan management would both be registered services, and they'd both be considered in that advanced category of registration. So similar to what plan managers are doing now, but same with support coordination. And then we've got that budget, legislative measure that's just come through, and that's looking at changing access pathways for how people would access the NDIS. You know, is it early intervention or is it as a result of a lifelong disability? It looks at changing budget settings, including what they're calling whole of budget, whole of person funding, and more flexible uses of their funding within a set budget. It's trying to deal with intra-plan inflation, of course, and stopping what government has been describing in the media as automatic top-ups. Not that automatic top-ups really exist, but we all know what they mean. They don't want people coming back for more money once a budget has been expended, which relies quite heavily on getting the planning right in the first place from government's point of view. And then, of course, there's quite controversial lists that have been covered in the media quite a lot. So what is and what is not an NDIS funded support? So that has been covered quite a lot in the media and is quite controversial. For providers and service delivery outfits, you know, it probably isn't going to radically change at this point in time how you're operating. But as I said, that change management piece for participants is coming very soon. So that in and of itself will be a big adjustment, I would say. So in summary, where are we at right now? So we know, and it's been recognised in various reviews, that intermediaries are currently the glue that holds the NDIS together. And in recognition of that, I think, and we should take this as recognition, this idea that navigators proposed by the NDIS review will be central to the scheme is really recognising that important role of intermediaries. But to take advantage of that, as intermediaries, you need to know what's coming down in the next 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, so that you can plan what your service will look like in the NDIS. If you want to deliver the services in the NDIS, you need to be able to plan for the future. So one of the main points of advocacy for us as the peak body right now with government at all levels is that the sector needs a roadmap. It needs to know where it's going over the next 5 years, and there will be requirements for structural adjustment along the way. if we want to see quality providers keep travelling down this road of the NDIS reform, if we want those quality providers into the future, there needs to be mechanisms along the way to keep them on board. So, considering all these recommendations, the announcements, the politics underway, what do we know about what's coming immediately, so around the corner? So we know there's going to be lots of changes, and when I talk about 5-year transition time, that's sort of what the NDIS review flagged to government. But I think we all know that reforms of this scale will take potentially a lot longer than that. But I think we should at least be aware of and plan for the next 5 years in particular to be quite intensive. And then there'll be a lot of bedding down and fixing. So what can you do over this period? I mean, what can you do to stay on top of everything this year, let alone over 5 years? So we've come up with some everyday actions, and this is the sort of thing we're talking to members about all the time in our network meetings and our conferences and events. So this is a long journey. It's not a 1-year proposition. So it's really important within that to try and maintain your energy, your burnout, your staff, your workload, so that you can keep going. Your boards, their questions about your sustainability, all of that stuff. It's a marathon, it's not a sprint. It's also really important that we have these conversations and that groups like NDS and others work together, both with providers and with our DROs, with our participant communities, with unions as well, because advocacy is a team sport. We are much stronger when we talk with one voice and we advocate together and we can find common ground. So that's a big thing that we're doing, and your input helps us to do that. There's also a lot of rumour mills going on out there, and there's a lot of information. So, I mean, Jeremy and I were just talking about it, I think, this week. Like, it's amazing when you hear some people's view of or interpretation of or what they've heard about something that's happening that just is not the case. So it's really easy to get caught up in that rumour mill and assume a change is coming when it hasn't, or assume something is government policy when it's not. So be careful with what information you're using to make those really critical decisions about your services. And, if you need to, come to a trusted source of information like a peak body or directly to the government source to make that decision. Make sure you don't get caught up in that rumour mill. And we are all having to prioritise what's important. What is it that you do well as a service? What is your unique offering that you do with participants? And focus on that and focus on improving quality in that because, we're playing the long game here. And stay mindful of your strategic plan. We're having lots of conversations at NDS with our board and with our members about the conversations they're having at the board table and in their leadership groups about their strategic plan. And I think gone are the days where it was like, you set it a 5-year strategic plan, set and forget, look at it every year and update it. We've got to be much more nimble in this environment. People are doing rolling strategic plans. People are, doing it 6-monthly, yearly, quarterly reviews. So absolutely, if that's not something you're not already doing, I would highly recommend it. Now, they're your everyday actions, but let's break it down, because when we talk about the big reforms, DRC, NDIS review, we probably need to drill down into them a little bit more. The Royal Commission made a huge number of recommendations across, again, it was just a giant report. There are members in my team who have read all of it cover to cover. I am not one of them because it is thousands and thousands of pages. But I do highly recommend, if you are going to read it, Volume 10 is where a lot of the work that's going to fall upon the services sector sits. But there's also some really important volumes in there, which is talking about participant experiences. I think it's Volume 1 and 2, Jeremy. But so I would focus in on that, or again, come to trusted sources of information like a peak to try and decipher it. There were quite a lot of recommendations in there, and we've been waiting for some time now for government's response for them. We were expecting it, earlier in the year, then it was going to be by end of financial year, but it has been delayed. But now we do have a combined federal, state and territory government response to all of those recommendations. You might have seen in the media that much of the participant community expressed that they were very underwhelmed by the government's response because a lot of the recommendations weren't taken up in full. They were accepted in principle, but we can go through that just briefly now to get a sense of it. The sort of recommendations that got the green light was, and in particular for this group, that everyone agreed that there needs to be adequate support coordination in a person's plan. You know, funding should reflect somebody's needs, funding should be sufficient for face-to-face contact, and it should be particularly strong for people who are at heightened risk. Everyone agreed you need to update the disability strategy, you need to improve the DES model, it should have an open employment for all of those things, really practical, no-brainer things were agreed to. But a huge number of recommendations were agreed to in principle. So it means, yeah, in principle, we accept that this is a good idea, but in terms of implementation, there's more work that we need to do. And that included some things in there for intermediaries. So for intermediaries, it talked about independent support coordination. So that was accepted in principle. And Jeremy, you'll just need to change the slide to the next one, thanks. So it said independent support coordination. Yes, in principle, not a bad idea, but you know, the devil's in the detail as to how you would do that and how you do that well without also removing services. And it also talked about the quality of support coordination. So particularly this recommendation was looking at, you know, what does support coordination look like in cold communities, First Nations communities, etc. And said, yeah, in principle, yes, we need to have quality support coordination, but what does that look like is something that we need to work out. And then there were all these recommendations that were either noted by governments or will be subject to, you know, further consideration, like a Rights Act, like segregated employment, special schools and the like. So going forward, there's a variety of work within that governments are now progressing, and various parts of government will be responsible for different elements of it. There is a reform coordination group sitting within the Department of Social Services federally, and they'll keep operating until next year, and they are coordinating that whole of government's response, and we'll be keeping a close eye on it as well. But moving on from the DRC, and I'm conscious of time, there's just so much. NDIS reforms, what do we know? It's still relatively early days with the NDIS review. I mean, 9 months is a long time, but also there's not a lot we know about what's happening next. There was some, you know, there's some really huge reforms in there around foundational supports, which is going to take a long time to work out, particularly navigators, and also big reforms around pricing. We touched on this before, but I'm sure, you know, given the recent advice to government, people will be thinking as well about the Provider Worker Registration Task Force. That's also going to take some time to unpack. I spoke to the acting NDIS commissioner in the last week, and his advice to us was it will take at least 24 months to come up with a new regulatory model for services, but they will prioritise registration for platform providers and unregistered still. Beyond that, and even that's not a public statement at this stage, we don't know where that one's heading, but it will be a 2-year program of reform. The Getting the NDIS Back on Track bill and as many amendments that went through Parliament in the last sitting period is the other big movement in NDIS reform. And that's that draft list of NDIS supports. It's changes to how budgets are set, and it should all be coming into force in various ways very soon. The bill will be getting royal assent and then will become law within 28 days of becoming law. And while a lot of sector attention has been on these immediate NDIS changes, we know that support coordinators and plan managers, meanwhile, are still waiting for clarity on reforms to intermediaries. So what do we know about reforms to support coordination and plan management? Well, we know what the NDIS review has recommended, and that's that instead of support coordination, we'll have this new navigator function. that they will be general navigators that operate across all disability services, both, state, territory, federal and non-NDIS services, and that within that there needs to be specialist navigators that are doing things like homes and living, shared supports, children and families, people with psychosocial disability. So at this stage, that's all we know about it. Government has not come out and said what that will look like and against what time frame, other than reform will take 5 years. On plan management, if we take what is said in the NDIS review, there are significant changes to plan management coming in the future, and it's a total shift of the service model. So the NDIS review proposes all these big investments in digital infrastructure and a fully electronic payment system. So if taken up, navigators would be the ones helping people understand how to use their budgets, and participants would directly pay providers. And this, of course, raises a really big question about the future of plan management. And the review notes this and talks about the need for a transition plan for that part of the sector. So, like a lot of the proposed reforms, the practical details about what that looks like still needs to be confirmed. We still need governments to tell us what their intention is with this recommendation. Yeah, so what do we know? We do know that navigators underpin this new landscape. The titles and the structures and the terminology might be different, but yet again, the role of the intermediary is critical to not just NDIS services, but based on these reforms, disability services more broadly. So that's a good sign. In an evolving and difficult workforce, we know that the skills of intermediaries and that person-centred approach will continue to be in demand, and this is absolutely how the NDIS should operate. It's taking this long to get the design and effective implementation of PACE right. So look at PACE and then think about what's been proposed in terms of digital infrastructure and payments. And I think that gives us a fairly clear indication that nothing is going to happen quickly and that a lot of work needs to be done behind the scenes from a government point of view to try and implement some of these recommendations if indeed they take them up. So, it's fair to say that participants will continue to need support from intermediaries, particularly plan managers, for some time to come. And we know that disability services will have a voice at the table. We are at the table, others are at the table. There are forums we are in actively talking about this, but that's why it's really important that we hear from you as well. The other thing I just wanted to flag for this group is there's an 8% growth target on the NDIS, and people are talking about it as being a cap, and people are talking about savings in the scheme, and it is true that they are forecasting significant budget savings in the scheme, but it is still a very large scheme that is growing every year. So I think it is fair to say in that context there will always be a role for intermediaries with that person-centred approach, helping people navigate complex services to manage their disability in day-to-day life. So I think that's a real positive. Staying connected with everyone is going to be so important throughout this next chapter of reform. And it is also really important that we have a shared voice. So again, thank you for coming to this webinar. We're currently working on a campaign, so you are aware, on the pricing issue. The most recent annual price review, as I said, was just shocking, and we are advocating very strongly, along with other provider peaks, that there should be funding for registered providers, that there should be price increases for support coordination, and that things like this removal of high-intensity payments for behaviour support must be reversed. So we would love your help on this campaign. If that appeals to you, I might see if Jeremy, when he's not driving the slides, could put the link to the website in the chat, but go and check out the web page. We are working in partnership with a range of other organisations on this one. And as I said before, we'd also love to hear from you in our State of the Sector report. So there's the QR code. Please do get involved with it. We rely on your input and your real world advice for us to then shape our advocacy to government. So we'd really appreciate that. It only takes about 20 minutes. The other thing we're doing at the moment is we're doing quite a lot of work on, if navigators is a policy that government takes up, what should that look like? And where are areas of commonality with the disability representative organisations and participant community, for example. So Jeremy in our team is leading a piece of work with Dana, one of the national DROs, looking at common principles for navigators across provider groups and DRO groups, which is a really great piece of work. Another piece of work we're doing is we're looking at a reform roadmap, and we are mapping all the reforms from the Disability Royal Commission, the NDIS review, and we're saying, well, from a provider perspective, across all the different types of services, this is how we think a sensible sequencing of reforms could go. And along that path, this is the structural adjustment support we believe that providers will need to stay the course. So in that spirit, and when we open up for questions now, we'd also like to pop up a Mentimeter slide. And we'd love for you to jump on there. And there's just a few short questions in there for you to do. And you can take your time and we can chat while we're doing it. But the stuff that you give us in these sorts of questions and the polling is the lifeblood of what we then go away and use for shaping some of this stuff. And we can talk through some of the results as well as they're coming in. But Barry, I might pause there and let you and Jeremy guide the Menti and the chat.
Perfect. Thanks so much. And thank you again for the excellent presentation. It really is a very difficult space that the intermediaries find themselves in, be it support coordinators, plan managers, and even LACs, given the uncertainty, whilst the day-to-day operations of LACs is perhaps a little bit more straightforward, given the funding model, the uncertainty that it faces the intermediary sector affects the LACs just as much as it does support coordination and plan management. Jeremy, did you want to go to the first question for the Mentimeter to see if we've got that operating?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Barry. And thanks, Em, too, for sharing a lot of information. We speak with a lot of providers, and I think even though, to be blunt, it sucks that there isn't all the answers and all the certainty right now. What it does present is an opportunity to be able to shape those answers and influence those next steps with the feedback from our voices together. So that's why we're running, as Em mentioned, those different projects around the reform roadmap and also around the Navigator project and what the principles of those roles should be. And we think they should be shaped on what the current experiences are of intermediaries, of plan managers and support coordinators in that space. That's why it's incredibly important to grab these sorts of different information. We've got 200 people from across the sector all together today, and to have that information coming in from you and your on-the-ground experience, the people who will be delivering these quality supports going forward, is really, really important. So I thought we've got a couple of questions to get through today. As you can see on your screen, the first one here is what's currently keeping you up at night? Somewhat of acknowledgement of the difficulties that the sector is facing, and particularly the extra weight that's currently on your shoulders, helping participants navigate all this uncertainty on top of the uncertainty that you're feeling as well. Viability is indeed one of the most popular responses, or most frequent responses that we hear back from providers in that space. It's really tied into the Secure a Better Future for the NDIS campaign, and recognizing that for a 5-year transition, we're not going to be able to get you through 5 years if we can't get you through year 1, 2, 3, and 4 first. So I think that viability in the future and that understanding around how to navigate and, how to interface with the NDIS while you're doing all this work is absolutely coming up. If you're feeling this at the moment, can definitely assure you that this is absolutely happening elsewhere. And I'm wondering, even Barry, if we wanted to maybe give people some more time to answer the poll questions, and maybe we can address some of the Q&A that's happening in chat while we're giving some people some more time to fill out their responses. Would that be a winner to maybe launch into some of the Q&A?
Yeah, that'll be perfect, Jeremy. And I think it's also worth just highlighting, at MyIntegra, we're a larger provider. And it's virtually impossible to operate support coordination. Well, it is impossible to operate support coordination and even break even in the current environment. Bernie in the chat was commenting on, the cost of just maintaining our registration, the audit costs. And as we were sharing, it's the cost of the audit is one thing. The cost of the people that's required to get through that process is another thing altogether, and a much greater cost. And I just wanted to say to all of the audience that's there that, we're committed to seeing this through here at MyIntegra, and I'm very lucky that I've got a board that's prepared to fund us to continue operating until we get to where this is going. So if you are out there and you are having trouble, if you do want to talk to someone, if you just want a bit of support, feel free to reach out to us. And I know the NDIS is the same. They're very supportive organisation. We've got DIA who are also trying to support. But yeah, the team at MyIntegra, and myself personally in particular, if I can help in any way, please reach out. You have the details via the registration on how to contact us. You can get my email via that. So Rob, did you want to lead off with any of the questions that have come through?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Barry. We mentioned Bernie. Bernie's given us a few comments, so I'll just go to the first one from them, which is: Have you had any government responses to these issues that you can share? Are future submissions happening? Just for context, I believe that was around the time you were talking about the pricing or the lack of change to pricing.
There's a point within that word cloud that says frustration with the NDIS, and I really resonate with that, because my frustration is with the NDIA, which is the body responsible for the price setting. We have heard in closed-door meetings that action is underway to address the removal of high-intensity payments for behaviour support, that there is action underway to address other long-standing issues with the pricing, like incorrect application of indexation for SIL in participants' plans. And I've heard less reliably, but I've also heard that there are some considerations being made to some sort of relief mechanism for support coordination. But I've also heard these things before. I've heard it before on indexation. I've heard it before on support coordination. So whilst we are not stopping the advocacy, while I am hopeful for some things, I'm also fairly cynical at this stage as to how much government is willing and able to do at this point in time. I think the price relief and looking at particularly the costs of registration and running an organisation, let alone a registered organisation, is such a critical argument for why we need independent pricing. And it's not to say that independent pricing done by, for example, the Independent Aged Care Pricing Authority will fix everything. It's not a silver bullet. Pricing is not just going to suddenly fix all the long-standing issues that we're dealing with. But I think it'll be a darn sight better than the situation we're in now. The fact that there's been price freezes for half a decade on most of the services delivered by NDIS providers is a completely untenable position. If none of our wages went up over 5 years, we wouldn't be paying our mortgages. We wouldn't be able to buy all our expensive groceries. The same pressures happen to providers on a larger scale. So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think I'll just add to that, Em. I think one of the things that we've definitely been hearing, and what was mentioned in the session today, is from these huge inquiries, from these hundreds and thousands of pages that we now have all these findings around what contributes towards good quality service, what things are needed and wanted throughout the Australian community. And I think in terms of that independent pricing approach, I think that's a real opportunity to see, to have that reflected in this space. And if we know from the different reports and the different advice that's been coming through that visibility of providers is going to be really, really important. We know that registration is currently the vehicle, the method they're looking to achieve that. And having costs or pricing that reflects the costs in upholding that quality will be incredibly important. And we can even see from our peers here today that in terms of registration and what that model needs to both, I guess, look like, but also be reflected in as part of the cost of doing good quality business, that's what the sector wants to see. There's 70-ish% 50% of people in the room today think that registration needs to be part of support coordination going forward. And I think that process really needs to be improved if we're going to be able to get everyone in that space to do it continuously.
Emily, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. And I was just going to reflect on the answers to this question. As I said, I was only just recently speaking to the acting commissioner, and we've got a new commissioner starting at the end of September, Louise Glanville, who's an ex-deputy CEO at the NDIA, which would be interesting. But the advice from the current leadership at the commission is government doesn't want to see a large unregistered market, but nor do they want to see services and the availability of supports falling over by trying to cram everyone into what is a deeply imperfect registration scheme system as it currently stands. So pleasingly, there is absolute agreement from the Commission, which is responsible for the regulatory environment, that it is not up to scratch. They have been under-resourced and underfunded for some time. Their systems are not capable of dealing with suddenly trying to register 200,000 odd active providers in the scheme, but they do want to start prioritising what a better registration scheme looks like. And one of the big things we keep talking to them about that they acknowledge is the sheer cost of being registered. Providers want to do quality service. They recognise that with a good regulatory system, that's part of that quality assurance, a big part of it. But if it's costing $30,000, $40,000 just to do an audit, let alone all the staff you need to do that, let alone all the red tape and burden you're doing and the duplicative systems you're trying to manage, you can see why people don't do it. It's not worth it if it's not covered.
Yeah. Emily, and Jeremy, I'm just going to go back to the previous question for a moment and around the funding. And I think it's important to understand, or from my dealings with people within the agency and with other bodies as well, that we can't expect to see a price change, even though they've put a pricing review in. Everyone acknowledges that support coordination is doing it extremely tough. There is no mechanism or discussion around an interim price relief that I'm hearing. So it's not going to be until the next pricing review at the middle of next year that there would be an opportunity for that price to change. And I think it's important that we're just clear and understand that the situation today is what it's going to be like until June or July of next year. And even then, there's no guarantee that there will be a change at that point, which makes it just so difficult. And there was what we're seeing in plan management and support coordination both is that the agency wants to affect change. And one of the ways they're doing it is just by making it more difficult, which is a terrible way to do it, that so-called death by 1,000 cuts. And the plan managers, and I'm not sure how many plan managers are on the call, but plan managers are also doing it extremely tough with just the increasing compliance burden that's been and barriers that have been put onto the providers. So yeah, it's not good news. I will just say, Rob, there were a few more questions. Anything else that we can quickly address before we run out of time?
Yes, I'll try and run through a couple really quickly. One from Sandy Gill. We are seeing a lot of DV situations for participants. I'm assuming that's domestic violence. The DV providers have advised that this is due to reductions in participants' NDIS funding. DV providers do not have capacity due to their overwhelming intake. There is no emergency housing due to the housing crisis. It ends up falling on providers. We are not an emergency service, and the response time from emergency services is significantly long. What is the best way to manage moving forward? Quite a big question.
It's such a big question, and it's such an awful situation. And I think the best thing you can do is keep reporting that to the NDIS Quality and Safeguarding Commission. This is their role to manage the quality and safety of services across the scheme. And if they're not able to be delivered in a safe way, if they're not funded, if they're not available, they need to know, because they're the direct conduit to the minister and government about this. It is awful. It's an awful situation, though. And not in relation to DV specifically. I'm not surprised it's happening. But in relation to all sorts of things like challenging behaviours. And I mean, we've got providers who are saying, well, what do I do with this client? I haven't got the funding to take them on. They need a particular sort of support. It might be very complex. I haven't got the workforce to do it. You know, and some organisations have been wearing that cost where they can, and others are just having to say no to those clients.
Yeah.
And then what happens to them? They end up in hospital, they end up in institutional sort of arrangements, they end up in the justice system. It's not a good outcome.
Thanks for that. I'll try and fit in a couple more before we tie up. I will just say to everyone, please add questions in. Any questions that we don't get to, we'll provide written responses to after and send that out to everyone as well. So we will provide a response to you. One question from Kelly Day. So no more plan managers, question mark.
The recommendation of the NDIS review is that it would transition away from plan management as we know it now. Yep, that is the recommendation of the review. But again, that's not government policy. So what that looks like and how long that is the big question.
I think there's an important differentiation there also, Rob, between payments and plan management. And the government wants to internalise the payment system, that's for sure. However, the role of the plan manager, which is by far the more important part of that whole role, that is something that needs to be ongoing. Maybe that sits within the navigator role, but we don't know.
Yeah. Two other questions that are related. One from Melanie Kinsman. Will navigators be employed directly by the NDIS? And Christy, who asks, do you know if navigators will be able to operate as a sole trader, or they need to be linked to a large company, or they need to be employed directly by the federal government?
Yep. Really good questions. They are exactly the questions we are also asking government. And government is asking amongst itself, because this goes right to the heart of the complexity of the reform agenda, because what that looks like, who's employing them, what should they be, who pays for them, is the question that states and territories and the federal government need to nut out. Because, again, they're not just sitting necessarily within the NDIS. They may be sitting in foundational supports and across the two schemes. And state governments and territory governments will have their own views about, you know, what services they need in their area, how they should be commissioned and employed, who employs them, for example. So that is all unknown at this stage.
Yep. And we've got 2 minutes left. Do you want to kind of finish with the question or talking about the poll again? What would be best for you guys?
What do you reckon, Jeremy? Is there anything in there you want to highlight?
I was just going to say, I'm happy to share the responses of Mentimeter, considering the variety of responses that came through as part of the slides that go out. That can probably leave us with some time for any final questions or even one final plug for the State of the Disability Sector Survey.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, and Emily, thank you as well. It's a fantastic presentation. We are hitting the absolute limit of our time. I'm happy to stay online for those people who want to ask a few more questions, or we can continue to chat for a little while, but I do want to just allow people to get on with their day. It is a difficult time for support coordination, and I really, and on behalf of all of the presenters, want to thank you for taking the time to join us. It is really important that we understand the challenges that we're all facing, and that we work together to try and come up with any solutions. Just as I said at the start, you know, if you are having troubles, if you do want to talk to anyone, I'm always welcome to, or always open to a conversation. And we do have the team from NDIS and DIA who can also provide support. Any final comments, Emily, before we finish up?
No, just thank you so much for having us. And we're doing quite a lot of work in the background, and I think there'll be, you know, there's always more to say on this stuff. But, you know, maybe, Barry, we can talk about coming back later in the year, towards the end of the year, and we can see where the advocacy has gone and what we know more of once we've got some more signals from government. I think it's a good conversation to have.
Fantastic. And Jeremy?
No, I think it's great for us to all be able to come together and to get this feedback and to share it along. It'll be a long road ahead, but I think the fact that we're all here and able to do things together will really be able to strengthen our collective voice. So thanks so much for joining in.
Fantastic. And I just then want to do a big thank you to the team in the background who have made this possible. So Rob, who's been doing questions with us, and then also Natalie and Jani, who made the whole webinar and have run the whole thing possible today. So thank you, everyone. As I said, I'm happy to stay online if there's any further discussion points. Otherwise, I'll let you get on with your day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.